Every shift, he walked up to a furnace hotter than the surface of the sun, raised an iron rod, and knocked out the plug. He had 2 seconds to step back. Sometimes 2 seconds was enough. This is the story of the Open-Hearth furnace tapper, the second helper. The man at the end of an 8-hour heat who stood in front of a furnace holding 200 tons of liquid steel, did the one thing that released all of it, then got out of the way as fast as his legs would carry him. If you are watching Steel and Sweat for the machines and the men who ran them, subscribe now and leave a comment telling me which industrial job or machine from this era you want covered next. Every comment reaches the people who care about these stories. To understand what the second helper was walking toward on every tap, you first have to understand what was behind that plug. An open-hearth furnace is not a small thing. The building that houses a row of open-hearth furnaces is typically the largest enclosed structure on a steel mill site, a brick and steel cathedral several hundred feet long and several stories high, with a row of furnaces along one side and a network of overhead cranes running the length of the building to move ladles and materials. The Gary Works building that housed Open-Hearth No. 4 was 1,700 feet long. That is longer than 5 football fields, end to end, under one roof, with 14 furnaces burning simultaneously, each one the size of a railroad car interior and holding tens of tons of liquid metal at temperatures your skin registers before your brain has processed what you are looking at. Each furnace is a shallow, rectangular enclosure built into the wall, lined with refractory brick that can withstand sustained temperatures well above 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, with a massive arched roof above the hearth that contains the flames and reflects heat back down onto the metal below. The flames burning over that open hearth are produced by burning gas or heavy fuel oil, preheated by a system of regenerator chambers on each end of the furnace that captured waste heat and used it to preheat the incoming fuel and air. This regenerative system is what allowed the open hearth furnace to sustain flame temperatures high enough to melt and refine steel, temperatures that in the flame itself exceeded what the steel below could withstand. But the fire is not what you see when you stand in front of an operating open hearth furnace. What you see is the door, a massive rectangular opening sealed most of the time, from which a radiant heat presses outward so intense that men on the floor wore protective shields over their faces and still felt it penetrating their clothing several feet back. When the door opened, even briefly, the interior was a chamber of white-yellow light that made the shop floor outside look dark by contrast. And the wave of heat that came through the opening was not gradual. It arrived all at once, like stepping in front of a furnace sized for giants. A single heat, meaning one batch of steel from charge to tap, took 8 to 12 hours. Not 20 minutes like the Bessemer converter. 8 to 12 hours of sustained heat, sampling, chemical adjustment, and monitoring before the furnace was ready to release what it had made. By 1930, more than 80% of all steel made in the United States came from open-hearth furnaces. The Homestead Mills No. 2 open-hearth shop ran 16 furnaces simultaneously, each producing 40 tons of steel every 6 hours. The Gary Works of U.S. Steel, when fully operational, had 38 open-hearth furnaces running. The scale of the thing was almost impossible to comprehend from the outside. Inside, with the furnace doors open and the heat pressing against your face and the overhead cranes moving ladles that weighed several tons across the shop. It was simply the world you lived in for 12 hours at a time. At the back wall of each furnace, opposite the charging side, was the tap hole. It was a small opening in the refractory lining, plugged at the end of each heat, with a mass of fire clay rammed in by hand after the previous tap. The plug was not sophisticated engineering, it was clay. Dense, heat-hardened, packed by the man responsible for doing it correctly because his colleagues' lives depended on it. Behind that clay plug, when the furnace was ready, was the entire heat, all the liquid steel the furnace had refined over the preceding 8 to 12 hours, pressing against the refractory from the inside at 2,900 degrees Fahrenheit. When the melter foreman determined the heat was ready, when the temperature was right and the chemistry was right, verified by drawing a small sample of metal out through the door and testing it, the tap was called. and that call belonged to the second helper. The line of promotion in the Open-Hearth department ran a specific course. John Fitch, the journalist and sociologist who documented the Pittsburgh steel industry in 1908, described it precisely. Every man in every department of mill work was in training for the next position above. In the Open-Hearth department, that line ran from common laborer to metal wheeler to stock handler to cinder pit man to second helper to first helper to melter foreman. You did not skip steps. You did not arrive as a second helper from the outside. You earned each position in sequence, spending time in each role until the men above you trusted you enough to move you up. The cinder pit man worked at the bottom of the pit below the tap hole, the space where the ladle sat to receive the heat. In the period between taps, the pit was where slag and drips and spillage collected, and the cinder pit man was the person responsible for keeping it clear of anything that could produce a steam explosion when liquid steel arrived. He was also the person with the clearest view of what a tap actually looked like from underneath. If the plug blew unevenly, if the steel came out sideways, if the ladle positioning was wrong, he knew before anyone else. But his job was not to make that call. That call belonged to the men above him in the hierarchy, and his job was to learn by watching until his turn came. The second helper was the fourth or fifth position in a climb that took years. By the time you stood in front of that tap hole, you had shoveled cinder, wheeled metal, charged scrap, watched 100 taps from a safe distance, and stood beside the man you were eventually going to replace while he showed you what he knew. The knowledge that mattered on tap day was not written anywhere. It was in the hands of the man who held the rod, in the way he read the sound of the plug giving way, in the fraction of a second decision about whether the steel was moving cleanly or not before he committed his weight to a direction and moved. That knowledge, transferred by proximity, by repetition, by a few hundred hours of standing close enough to a tap to feel the heat of it on your forearms and watching how the experienced man moved when it opened. In the early era of open-hearth steelmaking, the tap itself was a physical act of considerable directness. A period account describes it this way. A big ladle was brought into position beneath the tap hole. A workman ran a crowbar through the clay stopper holding back the molten metal, and it ran out like buttermilk from a churn. The slag that accompanied it rose to the top like oil on water and overflowed the sides when the ladle became full. What that description underplays is the physics of what was happening behind the plug. The tap hole was in the back wall of the furnace, at a low point in the hearth where the liquid steel collected by gravity. Behind it was the full weight of the heat pressing forward, not just its own mass, but the hydrostatic pressure of 200 tons of liquid metal at 2,900 degrees Fahrenheit, finding the lowest available point. When the iron rod broke through the clay, the steel did not pour out gradually. It came out with the force of its own enormous mass behind it, a river of liquid metal at 2,900 degrees Fahrenheit, moving fast into the ladle below. The river was roughly as wide as the tap hole, several inches across, and it dropped through a spout into the pit below, where the ladle waited. Men who worked those floors described the sound of it hitting the interior of the ladle as something between a roar and a sustained explosion. The man who had driven the rod through had a window in which to get back before the spray and the radiation and the sheer heat of that pour reached him. 2 seconds is not an exaggeration. Experienced second helpers did not linger. They put the rod through with a single committed stroke and moved before they finished the motion, a choreography so practiced it became automatic. But automation built from repetition is only as reliable as the situation it was built for. When the heat was unusual, when the plug was harder than normal or softer than normal, when the pressure behind it was different from what the man's muscle memory expected, the 2 seconds could compress. But the crowbar era was the simpler version. As furnaces grew larger and heats grew heavier, reaching into the 300 to 400 ton range at some mills, the tap became more mechanized. By the mid-20th century, the standard device at many mills was what was called a jet tapper, and the backstory of what the jet tapper actually was reveals something about the era it came from. The device was placed outside the still plug tap hole at the end of each heat. It contained an explosive charge. When the second helper, or designated crew member, pushed the button at a remote firing station, the resulting concussion blew out the fire clay plug and released the heat. The device itself was destroyed by the flow of molten steel immediately after. What the engineers at Bethlehem Steel and other mills had adapted for this purpose was an armor-piercing artillery shell from World War II. The same technology developed to punch through tank armor at velocity was repurposed to punch through a clay plug in a furnace wall on a steel mill floor in Pennsylvania. The ladle, waiting in the pit below, held the tap. If the ladle was in position, if the crane operator had it correctly placed, if the refractory lining of the ladle was preheated and dry, the tap was routine. If any of those conditions was not met, the tap was not routine. There is an account from Bethlehem Steel, documented by a man who worked in the Open-Hearth shop there, of a furnace ready for tap and a second helper signaling that he was not ready to open it. If you are finding this history as absorbing as I do, go ahead and subscribe right now and drop a comment with the next industrial job or machine you want me to dig into. A foreman named Lou Fields, known as a driven and impatient man, became furious at the delay and ordered the second helper to tap the furnace. The second helper tapped it. What Fields did not know, and what the second helper made the decision not to tell him, was that there was no ladle in the pit. The crane had not yet positioned it. The entire heat, 200 tons of liquid steel at 2,900 degrees Fahrenheit, poured through the tap hole and into an empty pit and spread across the floor of the ladle bay as a catastrophic molten puddle. Fields was a capable enough foreman that the incident, which in most industries would have ended a career, resulted in him being given a different supervisory position at a comparable level. Steel mills in that era lost equipment and floor space to liquid metal with enough regularity that systems of response existed for it. But that does not mean the people in the vicinity were safe while it was happening. The word for what happened at Bethlehem that day, and for the more random version of the same event that occurred when a furnace lining eroded too far between heats, was breakout. A furnace breakout meant the refractory wall had been pushed past its limit by heat or chemical erosion or physical stress, and the liquid steel found its own way out before anyone called a tap. It came through the wall, through the floor of the hearth, through wherever the lining was thinnest. It moved fast, spread fast, and the only response was to get everyone in the building away from it and wait for it to cool enough to be dealt with. The Open-Hearth crews knew the term breakout, the way sailors know the term shipwreck. It was a word that carried weight because of what it described happening to people. The physical experience of working in the Open-Hearth shop extended well beyond the tap itself. The furnace operated continuously across 12-hour shifts, and the heat radiating from a row of operating furnaces was not background noise. It was the atmosphere, and it was heat. Workers on the hearth floor moved in and out of zones of intense radiant heat, from the furnace doors to the cooler sections of the building, repeatedly across each shift. The Open-Hearth building at a large mill like Homestead or Gary was never quiet, never cool, never free of the smell of burning fuel and oxidized metal and the specific sulfurous quality of a heat in its refining phase. The overhead cranes moved ladles and charging buckets above the floor constantly. Molten pig iron arrived from the blast furnaces in submarine-shaped railroad cars, refractory-lined vessels that looked exactly as they sound, which were brought directly into the shop and tipped by crane to pour the iron charge through the furnace doors. The iron arrived at roughly 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant the truck carrying it to the furnace door was itself radiating heat across the shop floor. The men who worked that floor described the sensation of heat not as a temperature reading, but as a physical presence, something that leaned against you from multiple directions at once, and that you built a tolerance for slowly, over months, until it stopped registering as unusual and simply became the air. A steel worker at Homestead in 1894 said something that applied to the Open-Hearth floor as precisely as anywhere else in the mill. "You do not notice any old men here. The long hours, the strain, and the sudden changes of temperature use a man up." By 1890, the Open-Hearth shop at Homestead was already one of the largest in the world. 16 furnaces in one building, each producing 40 tons of steel every 6 hours. Carnegie had invested heavily in the Open-Hearth process, specifically because it produced a higher grade of steel than the Bessemer converter, steel with lower nitrogen content and better consistency, suitable for structural applications that demanded reliable material properties. The Homestead Mill's Open-Hearth steel went into the armor plate for United States Navy vessels in the 1890s and into the structural shapes for buildings in New York and Chicago. The men who tapped those heats were producing material that would hold up skyscrapers. They were doing it in leather aprons in a building where the floor temperature was high enough that the moisture in the concrete could produce a steam explosion if liquid metal reached it. The wages for that work in 1890 averaged around $10 a week for most of the Open-Hearth crew, roughly the same as other skilled positions in the mill. The melter foreman, the top of the hierarchy, earned more. The common labor at the bottom earned less. The second helper mid-hierarchy had climbed far enough to earn meaningful money by the standards of a Pittsburgh immigrant family in 1895. But meaningful money in 1895, Pittsburgh was still a wage that required a man's wife to take in boarders and his oldest children to contribute earnings before their teenage years ended. The steel wages that seemed substantial when measured against what a farmhand earned in Poland or Slovakia or the rural American South were wages calibrated to what the industry needed men to accept in exchange for the privilege of steady work in a growing economy. The men who came to those mills had come from everywhere. Pittsburgh and Braddock and Gary and Bethlehem drew workers from Poland and Slovakia and Croatia and Hungary and the American South. And the Open-Hearth floor was where those men ended up together, in the same building, doing the same rotation of 12-hour shifts, speaking different languages, and navigating a hierarchy that did not require shared language to understand because the job itself was the curriculum. The human cost and the wages that sustain this work tell part of the story of how American industry was built. You learned what the men above you knew by standing next to them until the knowledge transferred. The industry had determined, as Charles Schwab of Carnegie Steel stated in 1902, that it could take a green hand from agricultural work and make a functional steel melter of him in 6 weeks or less. What that statement acknowledged was that the knowledge gap was not insurmountable, but what it concealed was that the knowledge gap and the physical risk gap were not the same thing. You could learn the sequence quickly. Learning how to keep your body intact across 20 years of 12-hour shifts in a building where liquid metal could reach you from multiple directions was a different kind of education, and it was not one the industry designed for the benefit of the student. By the 1930s, the Open-Hearth furnace was the dominant steel-making technology in America, producing steel for the country's bridges, building frames, and railroad infrastructure. By World War II, it was producing the steel for Liberty ships, the standardized cargo vessels built in American shipyards at a rate the world had never seen. At peak production at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, the yards were turning out one ship every 42 days, and each one required more than 2,000 tons of Open-Hearth steel plate. The second helpers on the wartime night shifts were doing the same job their predecessors had done in peacetime, walking up to the tap hole, opening the clay plug, stepping back. The ships those taps built carried soldiers across the Atlantic and supplies to Murmansk. Some of those ships were sunk. The steel that was not sunk has been at the bottom of the ocean for 80 years, and it is still holding. But the Open-Hearth furnace was not going to last forever, and the process that replaced it came out of the same war that had demanded so much of it. The basic oxygen furnace, first used commercially in Austria in 1952, took the fundamental insight of the Bessemer converter, blasting oxygen through molten iron to burn off carbon and impurities, and improved it with pure oxygen instead of air, eliminating the nitrogen contamination that had been the Bessemer's weakness. A basic oxygen heat took 30 to 40 minutes instead of 8 to 12 hours. For steel companies calculating the economics of a post-war expansion, the math was straightforward. The Open-Hearth furnace, with its 12-hour heat cycle and its enormous fuel consumption and its building-length infrastructure requirements, was becoming an expensive way to do something that could be done faster. Mills that had run open-hearth shops for 50 years began converting to basic oxygen furnaces in the 1960s and the 1970s. The buildings came down one by one. The second helper jobs disappeared, not through injury or retirement, but through the economics of a technology transition that took about 30 years from first adoption to completion. The last open-hearth furnace in the United States was shut down in 1992. By then, the basic oxygen furnace and the electric arc furnace had made the open-hearth process economically obsolete, both processes faster and cheaper for most applications. The process that had dominated American steel production for most of the 20th century ended without ceremony in most accounts. The buildings came down, the equipment was scrapped, the men who had run those furnaces retired, moved to other work, or simply aged out of the industry that had used them. As of 2024, the largest remaining open-hearth operation in the world is the Zaporizhzhstal steel mill in central Ukraine, which runs 7 furnaces of 500-ton capacity. It is operating in a country at war for reasons of infrastructure and fuel availability and the particular economics of its situation. There are men there who still do the work that steelworkers in Pittsburgh and Gary and Bethlehem did for a century. The furnace is different in scale, but the physics are the same. The ladle waits in the pit, the plug holds. The second helper does the thing that releases 200 tons of what the furnace spent 8 hours making. He has 2 seconds to step back. The men who did that job in American mills for 100 years are not in textbooks. They're in John Fitch's 1908 labor study in grainy photographs from the National Archives showing open-hearth crews standing in front of furnace doors and leather aprons with their faces turned away from the heat. They are in the accounts of men like the second helper at Bethlehem who stood at a plugged tap hole and made a choice, and in the thousands of other men on thousands of other shifts who made the same choice without anyone writing it down. They are in the frame of the Empire State Building and the hull plates of ships that are now resting on the floor of the Atlantic, and in the bridges carrying traffic above rivers and cities those men never visited. They built a country that does not remember their names, from the inside of a brick building in Pittsburgh with a crowbar and 2 seconds to move.